Hello everyone, welcome back to the next part of Jennet Preston and what happened to her. And we're going to May 1612. I jumped as the door crashed open. We all watched the gaoler, wondering whose name he would call. Had William returned, or had Liz's Jack finally come to visit? Jennet Preston, here. My heart soared as he pressed the manacles over my wrists and locked them into place. William's here. Don't forget to bring food back, Maggie called out, and I nodded at her with a large smile. Life within this terrible place had grown easier after I shared the food from William's last visit. Now I had friends here. I turned towards the light, enjoying the feel of it on my face, even though it were considerably weakened. But the gaoler shoved me in the opposite direction. What is it? Where are you even taking me? The gaoler said naught, but used his cudgel to prod me towards the door, set into the dark, dank passage. He opened it and pushed me inside. 3 men sat at a board laden with meat and jugs of ale, but I could only smell the river foss on the other side of the stone wall behind them. It seemed a sham of William's visit, and I wondered if they'd purposely recreated the scene. The gaoler pushed me onto the small stool. I raised my hands to have the manacles removed, but he only moved behind me to stand before the door. My heart sank as I regarded the 3 men. I knew them all. Thomas Lister, the man who devised all my woes. Thomas Heber, the magistrate who'd failed to convince the Lent assizes of my guilt on my behalf. Roger Nowell, the Lancaster witch hunter, who had me at his mercy at Reed Hall less than a month before, and who pursued so many of my Pendle friends to the gaol at Lancaster. All 3 were dressed in their finery, and I spared a thought for the poor washerwoman who would be tasked with removing the grime and stench of this gaol from their padded doublets, woolen hose and linen shirts. Even the imposing, tall-crowned hats remained atop their heads in defiance of good manners. "Are you hungry, Mistress Preston?" Roger Nowell indicated the spread before him with an inviting hand. I said naught. I already knew his tricks. I hoped I would not be learning more this day. "Answer our questions and you can eat and drink your fill." Nowell picked up one of the jugs and poured some of the contents into a goblet. The liquid were red, wine then, not ale. Despite me saying, my eyes fixed on the goblet, and I could not move them away. Thomas Lister reached over to the roasted bird. Peahen or goose? I could not tell from this far distant. He pulled a leg from the carcass, and the smell of its flesh flooded my nose. My mouth watered, and I could tell by his smile that he knew it. I said naught. "You may even be allowed to go home and live out your days with your husband." I jerked my eyes to Nowell's and stared at him in shock. Could he really mean that? He smiled, and my guts churned. "First things first," Lister said, and the disturbance in my guts grew more violent. He had no intention of allowing me to return to Gisborne. "Confess your witching of my father." I said naught. He pointed the leg of meat at me and raised his eyebrows. Hunger and fear combined to make me nauseous. My mouth flooded with moisture. I swallowed it down, determined not to show my terror to these men. "Tell us of the pact you made with the devil," Lister said, as he leapt to his feet. And then, instead of just saying, he roared, "Confess to the murder of my father." Heber reached out a hand to Lister's forearm, and the young man took a deep breath, sat, nodded, and took the goblet of wine for himself. Roger Nowell cleared his throat. "Let us begin afresh," he said. "What is the form of your familiar?" I said naught. "Did you use any of Thomas Lister's clothing to curse him after you'd done away with his father?" Surprise forced the word out of me. "No." What were he talking about? What did you do to cause Thomas Lister his recent great losses? What losses? I said then, regretting my words, as Noel smiled. I knew how this would go. I were reminded of my first days at Reed Hall, where Noel had forced me to change my clothes before him and two of his retainers. The women had shaved every part of me in her examinations, and he'd asked me questions like this. Although then he had been asking about the Devices, Chattocks, and others who lived in or about Pendle. My blood ran cold and I shivered, wondering what he would do to me today. Did you repair to Demdike's abode, Malkin Tower, to ask her kin for aid in cursing Thomas Lister, here and his uncle, Leonard Lister? I said nought. Come, woman, Heber slammed his fist on the board. Answer these questions and you may eat. I didn't believe him, and cursed my belly for its groanings, which I knew the men heard. If you don't confess, perjury will be added to your list of crimes, Noel said with a chiding glance at Heber, who poured himself a goblet of wine. I stared at him and said nought. Lister sighed in impatience. This is getting us nowhere. We must undertake the usual interrogations for a witch. Do you have your pricker? I could not help but grasp of fear. Noel stared at me a moment longer, then turned to Lister. She has already been pricked at Red Hall, and no mark were found. I also had her watched for 2 days and nights, and no imp or familiar was spotted. My mind cast back to the watching. He had tied me to a chair, where I stayed for 2 days and nights, little food or ale, forced me to soil my sen where I sat, and every time my eyes closed, to try to escape the torture, I was forced to waken. When they had finally set me free, I'd been unable to straighten my legs, and it had been hours until I were able to stand once more. Then they brought me here. Then we must take the next step, Lister said, with a frown. Which are? Heber asked, as he leaned forward to cut a slice of meat from the hunch of mutton before him. Penny for Theodore. What? Pressing, Heber asked. Surely that will not be necessary. I said no, although I had to force my lips against the pleas for mercy that wanted to escape. The thought of being pressed, being forced to lie on a stone floor, having the door laid over me, having that door weighted down with boulders until my poor body. I could not finish the thought. Surely they would not go that far. Gentlemen, there must be another way, Heber protested. Witchcraft is high treason against God's majesty, Lister said, and I hated him in that moment more than I ever thought possible, and so much torture is wholly justified. I made to stand. All I wanted were to hurt him, aye, even kill him. The Gowler's hands pushed me down before I had even halfway risen. But not if it kills her, crushes her to death, and she still does not confess, Heber persisted. It is akin to murder, then. We shall not press her, Noel said. I need her alive. Her conviction is important, not only for these assizes, but for the forthcoming trials in Lancaster. Then what? Lister said, disgust evident in his voice. With all your tricks, you have not yet secured any confession, neither here nor when you had her at Red Hall. Noel ignored him, then nodded at the Gowler behind me. I watched the man approach and place something from his scrape upon the table. I could not see what it were. He moved back to his previous position before the door. Roger Noel picked up the object, and I realised that, in fact, there were 2 of the iron implements. I watched in dawning horror as he held up the first one, so I could clearly see the 3 prongs. It were thummakin. He turned the butterfly screw on the central prong until it were near the top, then raised the iron plate beneath it. Every movement was slow and deliberate. He ensured that he had not only my full attention, but Lister and Heber's too. He stood and nodded to the gaoler, and I soon felt the man's hand on my shoulders, his belly behind my back, pressing me down to the stool despite my desperate squirming. Noel pushed my left thumb into the gap between the left and central prong of the device, and Lister helped him place my right thumb to the other side of the central screw. I'd not even noticed him rise from his seat. I were trapped, the gaoler using the weight to keep me in place on the chair. Manacles were holding me, wrists flushed together. And now Noel reversed the butterfly screw, tightening it, pushing the iron bar down on my thumbs, and pressing my thumbs against the second bar below. I gasped in pain as the bars pressed into my flesh and gritted my teeth, forcing my mind to focus on William, doing everything I could to block out what was happening here. "Is your familiar a white fool?" I said "Note," and he tightened the thumbscrew further. This time my gasp became a small scream, and I felt the pressure on my bones. "Did you seek vengeance to Master Lister for his prosecution of you for murdering the Dodgson child?" "No," I screamed desperately, trying to keep a picture of William's face in my mind as Noels tightened the thumbscrew until I heard and felt the cracks. Noel returned to the table to fetch the second thumberkin. He looked down at my feet. I curled my toes and cried out, "No!" Now that I screamed once, I could not stop, and the shriek after shriek rent the air. William's face flashed from my mind, time to time to be replaced by a gradual darkening. "Enough," I heard Ebba say. "That's enough. She's clearly bewitched herself into keeping her confession silent." That was Lister's voice. "Innocent I came to Gaul. Innocent I am tortured. Innocent I shall die." But I could not push the words out past my screams, and I finally slipped into a welcome, freezing nothingness. So that's the end of that part, guys. I really need to make it clear that, yes, this is exactly how they torture women, to get them to confess, and not just this type of torture either. Much, much more, actually. So it's important that we do remember those women, because they were tortured into giving confessions that were not true, and they were innocently murdered when they were hung. Thank you for listening. Join me again for the next part. Many blessings.